Okay, folks, let's go ahead and draw the long bone, which is associated with objective 1. So if you have not gotten checked off for objective 1, one thing that you can do is just draw me a long bone and tell me about its functions and relate that to the functions of the body as a whole. And so if you draw your long bone, the regions are always going to be kind of different, but you draw your basic long bone, you're going to have your ends, which are your epiphyses. So one epiphysis, two epiphysis, and we need to distinguish one for the other. So whatever is closest to the point of attachment is the proximal, and whichever one is closer to the end and further from the original point of attachment is the distal epiphysis. So this is singular. If you want to say them plural, then you have to say epiphyses. With an ES. So think, look at this epiphysis, look at these epiphyses, right? The middle section here is going to be your diaphysis. Dia means two or spanning between 2 points. So that's the diaphysis, that's the mid region of the bone. And then you're also going to have some stuff on the inside. So were you to scoop out, say, the middle of the bone, you would create a cavity, which is relatively narrow. And that's because along either side, this cavity is surrounded by, it's flanked by, but it's actually entubed by compact bones. So think about it like the outer shell of a mechanical pencil, and you've got a little hollow cavity on the inside, except it's not hollow, it's actually filled with fat. So let's go ahead and label this strong, dense tissue on the outside. That's called your compact bone tissue. This is a tissue, not an organ. Compact bone tissue. And this is the densest, strongest stuff and really protective. So if you have a bone functioning in protection, like the cranial cavity or the cranial bones, these are really, really thick with a lot of compact bone, as opposed to the other bone tissue, which is spongy bone. And that's really porous. So we're going to draw some dots in here to represent holes or pores. Think of the structure of like a loofah or a sponge, and you would notice that there are a lot of gaps or holes in between it. And that makes it lighter weight, it makes it compressible, and it makes it able to absorb and kind of soak up and store stuff. So we'll get back to that in a moment, but let's go ahead and label it. That is spongy bone tissue. Okay. Now let's get back to that cavity. So this cavity on the inside here, this is where we would call our medullary cavity, and it's present in all long bones. It's like a defining feature. Medullary cavity. And inside the medulla, or inside the medullary cavity, we store stuff, right? So nothing is hollow in the body. Well, with the exception of sinuses. Sinuses actually ought to be hollow. This is one of the only places that is not, and it's actually filled with a yellowish-esque substance called yellow marrow. And yellow marrow is involved in storing fat. And so yellow marrow is kind of what we cook out of bones when we make stock. So it's pretty flavorful. It's what scavengers go for when they pick through bones and break them apart. So that's that yellow marrow. So that's energy storage. And we have another type of marrow, which is our red marrow. And our red marrow is involved in hematopoiesis, or red cell production. And that red marrow is primarily located in spongy bone. And so in long bones, that would mean at the epiphyses. So that spongy bone tissue, remember we said it's porous and it's full of holes, and so it's really actually good for storing red marrow. And that is involved in hematopoiesis. So remember to say the poi in hematopoiesis, hematopoiesis, E-S-I-S. Okay, and so that's red cell production, and that kind of slows down in later life and is restricted to only the largest bones with the most spongy bone tissue. So things like the femur and parts of the hip bone will still be involved in that in an adult, but it's active everywhere in a child. Okay, so we've got different types of tissue, we've got different ends and regions. Now we need to create some protective caps for our ends of our bones, for our epiphyses. And so we're going to add, it's almost like a furniture cap, a little layer of cartilage, and that's your articular cartilage. And it's only found at the ends, and that basically protects it from abrasion. And it's real thin. It'll still conform to the overall shape. It's not going to smooth out or change the shape of this bone. It's just really hugging onto the top. But it's there to protect against abrasion in a joint. So if you have someone with arthritis, it's usually because of a problem with this articular cartilage. This articular cartilage may become inflamed because the neighboring bone might have a thinning, wearing, or tearing of the articular cartilage, causing calcified bone tissue, like rough, abrasive, sandpapery bone, to like grind against the cartilage until it becomes inflamed, and then the joint gets swollen and it's hard to move it. Sometimes it's becomes so worn away that you can have a grinding of bone on bone. And sometimes this articular cartilage breaks down just because of autoimmune diseases that cause the immune system to just randomly attack its cartilage and creates the same impact. Okay. Now, made of the same stuff as this articular cartilage is a band of cartilage that may or may not be present through the middle of the epiphyses, and this is the epiphyseal plates. So if you're growing, you'll have an epiphyseal plate because that is your growth plate. So it gets its name from the epiphysis. So same spelling, but then we have an EAL ending, which we know means pertaining to, and plate as in growth plate. Now, if that growth plate closes, and it will as you mature, then what we will see is not a growth plate that's thick in a big band like this, but what we'll instead see is a thinning of that epiphyseal plate into an epiphyseal line. And so as you get older, this region is no longer active, and so it seals and ossifies and becomes solid bone. And you can see it just as a faint line of where those cells used to be. But in a growing individual, we're going to see that as a wide band. And so the younger you are, actually, the bigger this region or this gap appears in a radiograph. Because again, this is made of hyaline cartilage. So say hello to your growth plate, hyaline cartilage. And cartilage is a tissue that is less dense than bone. So it's going to look gray on a radiograph. as opposed to the most dense tissue, which is compact bone, which is going to look super bright white. So what we'll see is basically it look like this area is invisible, like there's a gap between the epiphyses and the bone. Now you'll also see a natural gap or gray area between two neighboring bones in a joint because there's just soft tissue connections like ligaments or tendons that are spanning that gap. So as you look at one bone that connects with the next, you will see a gap, right, in that space. And that's natural. But if you see the clear outline of the end of an epiphysis and you see the clear outline of the proximal part of the diaphysis, then you're definitely looking at a band of growing tissue. And that means that person is relatively young. So these are the major parts of the bone. There's one more region that you should be aware of, and it's really difficult to see, but it's the periosteum, and this will be involved in bone growth that's lateral. So if you look at the outline of any organ, it usually has a outer wrapper. It's like shrink wrapped in a epithelial-like tissue. And so if you draw that, it goes all the way around. It really does go all the way around the bone. Should be just deep to the articular cartilage. So I kind of drew that wrong. So it should go underneath the cartilage here. But that is the periosteum. We're going to see that peri means around, osteo means bone, but we're going to see that that's going to be important in creating lateral growth or repair, right? Because this is going to create growth in the vertical direction, very much like your basal layer pushing out new cells to grow vertically, and the periosteum will have the capacity to add cells to the outer layer. So those are the parts of your bone. Look for areas that are involved in structure, support, storage, blood production, and attachment, and you'll be able to get your objective 1 check.